It's now late October in the garden, and that means it's time to think about bringing in tender begonias, dahlias, and fuchsias for the winter time. First to need our attention are the tuberous or comb begonias, because they won't take a frost. So as soon as the foliage begins to yellow, then lift them, bring them indoors and just wait until the foliage dies off completely, and then snap the stalks away. This will allow you then to begin to prepare them for storage. It doesn't make any difference whether you've grown them in the open ground, pots, or any form of container, but what you have to do is to carefully remove the comb and then gently begin to take the soil off from around the outside. It's better to wait until the soil's a little bit dry to do this operation. It comes away a little bit more easily. The one thing that you will notice is that the comb that you remove is far larger than the one that you put in. And over a couple of years, they can really get big, and then you can begin to cut them up and divide them and get more for your money. What you're really looking for is any soft spots, any sign of disease, any pests, especially vine weevil, which is notorious for overwintering in the compost, and then it begins to feed off the comb early in the spring as it comes through. So it's, as you can see, we move it away here, looking at it, and it does require you going back once or twice during the course of the winter to look to see if you've missed any or any signs of activity. What you were looking for is a little white grub about half an inch, 12 millimeters long, with a creamy colour skin and a little brown head. The eggs were laid back in the early summer, and as they pupated during the summer months, they then begin to feed off the roots and the plants themselves. They will emerge as wingless female adults next May time, and then begin to crawl into plants and begin to lay the eggs, and the cycle starts again. You can always tell when they're active because you'll see little scallop edges to the leaves, and that's the time to go looking for them. And if you want to control them, you can buy a biological control nematode that you can water into the compost. And whilst we're on the subject of compost, you'll get more problems with vine weevil in soilless compost than you will if you use a soil-based John Innes types. So it's well worth considering using John Innes type compost under glass. If you intend recycling the compost, then have a good look through it, riddle it a few times to make sure there are no remaining vine weevil in there. But it's quite safe to use them outside as a mulch, but I wouldn't actually use them inside the greenhouse again. Once you're satisfied that you've got the combs as clean as can be, then allow them to dry for a couple of hours, and then you can put them by to store. I use old shoe boxes filled up with scrunched up newspaper. All you need to do is make sure that you come back regularly during the winter months just to make sure everything is okay. Now we move on to dahlias, and dahlias are a slightly different proposition. You actually wait for the first frost of autumn to blacken the foliage, and this then puts the plant into a dormant state and tells us that it's time to lift them and prepare them for storage. The first stage of the process is to cut down all of the top growth, and it can be quite thick, and you'll notice a lot of the stems are hollow and will contain water. Cut the stems down to about 15 centimeters, 6 inches from where they come out of the soil, and then carefully begin to tease the soil away from around the tubers themselves. Here I'm using a pot-grown specimen to give you some idea of it, but it's the same thing when you lift the plants out of the soil. It's exactly the same process. And the reason we do all this is because, once again, we need to check the tubers to see if there are any vine weevil in there, especially if the plants have been raised in pots. And the other thing, of course, is slugs. And it could be slug eggs as well. So you need to get the tubers as clean as possible, the same way as we did with begonias before we put them away for store. And as I've already mentioned, the tubers and the stalks themselves can contain an awful lot of water, and what we need to do is to drain that water away before winter sets in, because we want the stems to be dry and the tubers to be completely dormant to avoid any potential frost damage. And now let's take a look at lifting the tuber directly from the soil. Once again, you can see we've cut down all the foliage within 15 centimeters, 6 inches of the soil. And what you then use, and I always use a fork rather than use a spade, because the spade you can just slice straight through the roots and leave a bit behind. But come well away from the main center of the crown. Loosen the soil gently all the way around, because you need to get underneath as much as possible, because you can never know how big the tube is going to be until you begin to lift it, and carefully check and pull it out of the soil. And as you can see, I've waited for a dry day and let the soil dry out slightly, so that it gives us a bit of a chance, because there's nothing worse than trying to lift and get rid of heavy soil. So shake off as much as you can, and you can see the tuber inside, and you can see the fine roots hanging off it. And we go through exactly the same process with this as we did with the tuber just shown from the pot. The purpose, once again, is to check to make sure that the tuber itself is healthy, there's no pests or diseases on it, and we can get them prepared it for winter storage. And the one thing to be aware of is that the tubers themselves can be very small or they can be quite large. Bishop of Llandaff, which I grow regularly, is notorious for producing very small tubers, which is why it doesn't overwinter very well if you can't provide it with the optimum conditions. But as you can see here, there's lots of soil clinging to it, and we're doing exactly the same. And what you would do with this is to, as I'm using a bucket, cut away any of the scruffy little bits that are preventing the plants from sort of drying out, and then just wait till the soil dries up and loosens, and then it falls away quite neatly. And here you can see a couple of tubers drying out, and this drying out process can be done in the greenhouse, outside if the weather's fine, or in a shed or a greenhouse. It doesn't really matter. But a week is a long time, and the soil quickly falls away, and here you can see a couple that I've been working on. The process itself can take about 3 weeks from start to finish. Here you see just teasing away with like a little toothpick, getting rid of little bits and pieces of the soil. You want to get as much as you can out, and you'd be surprised that no matter how dry they appear, you find the occasional slug curled up quite nicely inside. So it's worth taking your time, not rushing the job. Towards the end, I find I use a soft brush just to keep tickling it away, because the one thing you don't want to damage around the eyes, where the stalks come into the tubers themselves, where the eyes that will produce next year's flowers come from. So you don't want to go poking and prodding and damaging those. A good guide is to test the stems. Scrape the stem away with your nail or a knife, and if it's green underneath, then it still needs to dry a little bit more. And just wait until really that stalk is almost straw like. And when you scrape it, it's white, and that tells you then that everything is dried out. Because what's really happening, the tubers themselves are just sort of really becoming more and more dormant as time goes by, but you must make sure you get as much water away as possible. You can just see a little bit there of the green tissue on the plant itself. And this tells us that we need to wait just a little bit longer. But eventually, all our patience will be rewarded, and it's time to put the tubers into store. And it's quite a straightforward job. I like to use old compost, leaf mold, anything that I've saved over the course of the summer. And all you really want to do is to stick the nose of the toes, really, which is the ends, the tips of the tubers, into the compost, and that stops them from shriveling. And if you need to water them in any way, all you have to do is just lightly moisten the compost that's around the tubers themselves, and that will keep them turgid until the spring. Don't overwater them. Try to keep them as dry as possible without drying right out. And you'll be surprised, in the spring we can revive the tubers by soaking them, but we'll see more of that another time. You don't have to put all the same tubers in a box or container. You can mix them all up as long as they fit. They won't sort of transmit diseases to each other or anything like that. This is the most important thing to do is to make sure that the label is securely tied. And for the winter time, I like to use a bit of soft garden wire just to keep it there. The string or the fillets may rot, and make sure it really is secure, and then you'll have no problem identifying the plants in the springtime. At this early stage of boxing up, I just like to spray them over a few times just to settle the plants down, make sure that they're okay and that the tubers don't shrivel in the air too much. You can need to store them in a garage, a shed, outbuilding, as long as it's frost-free. A glass house, I don't know, it's borderline, but what you can do in the winter times is cover them with several layers of newspapers, or garden fleece if you want, or you can use them both. But just remember, if a really hard frost is forecast, and you can bring them in somewhere that will keep the hard frost out. I'm thinking of a hall or something like that. They can always be returned to the shed or an outbuilding the next day. There's no harm done. Finally, we look at fuchsias. And the ones that we're looking at are half-hardy fuchsias that you have to bring in and overwinter them summer protected, very similar to the dahlias. Once again, we wait for the first frost of autumn to pinch the plants, and this causes them to slow down and they'll begin to look a little bit sad. They'll drop their flowers, the leaves will begin to turn pale, and this is a sign to us that they're now ready for lifting and putting into storage. Pick the plants over and prune them back, just to get away with as much rubbish as you can. You need to get away all of the mushy flowers and the mushy leaves. We don't want them setting up diseases. The plants themselves, once you get them ready and under cover, are fairly hardy, but they won't tolerate being left outside all the winter time. And I like to cut them back to about 10 centimeters, 4 inches or so. But the cutting back treatment is exactly the same for hardy fuchsias that are grown outside. The only difference being is that you can throw a couple of inches of mulching material on the top of them to get them through the winter, and they'll be quite happy grown that way. To reduce the shock to the plants of suddenly being lifted or potted up and brought inside, initially I just prune them back so that the branches or the shoots finish roughly around the outside of the rim of the pot. This just makes them easier to store and work with, that's all. Once most of the leaves have dropped away and you're left with more or less bare stems, you can then cut them down to the 4 inches, 10 centimeters that I mentioned before. And then they're ready to be put by for storage. So you have to check the plants once again for any pests and diseases. You may get the odd plant that's very slow to drop its leaves and flowers, but just keep snipping away at it and it'll come in time. I mean, all you're trying to do is to encourage it to become dormant and help it along its way. Take up to 3-4 weeks for the plants to completely drop everything. The one thing I must stress at this stage, you withhold any water. You don't water anymore because what you want the plant to do is to slowly dry out the roots around the roots, and this will speed up the dropping of leaves process. You can see I've turned them on their side, and I will store them like that, either in a shed, garage, outbuilding. Could go under the staging in the greenhouse if you want, but as I say, you've got to be very careful with any green fly or white fly that may remain on the foliage of the plants. And here we have Tom Thumb, which is a wonderful plant. It's as tough as can be. I grow it in a pot. I bring it in the winter time just in case. But I always bring it in like this, covered in flowers. It still wants to keep on going, but you have to be a little bit cruel to be kind and cut it back. And I wouldn't think about taking any fuchsias at this, cuttings at this time of the year, because you're going to have a problem overwinter them. It's best to do what we would normally do is to cut these down to soil level in the spring. They will produce fresh shoots once we begin to water them, and we take our cutting material from there. Just to sum up, wait until the frost nips the plants, the leaves and the flowers begin to fall, and then bring them indoors, shortening them back, withholding water, and then you can stack them on their side, and so you can leave them outside. Sometimes I leave mine outside on the north side of a fence, and they let them, and the fact that they're dry keeps the frost out, and then they overwinter quite happily. Diolch, and thank you for watching. Goodbye for now, but if you would like to see any more, please hit the subscribe and like buttons.